Japanese swords were so short compared to European swords, except for the mighty Tachi and Nodachi. Is this correct? Let's look at it. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, I'm perhaps partly guilty of perpetuating this piece of information. I won't say a myth, because we're going to unpack whether it is or not. So first of all, there is the assertion that Japanese katana, or sword, perhaps more correctly called uchi katana, are short compared to European swords. Well, we're going to look at some European swords in a second. Is that true? Well, first of all, the length of a katana was specified by law at different points in time. Okay, so in reality, they tend to, I'm going to use inches here, they're going to vary, generally speaking, between about a 25-26 inch blade at the minimum, up to usually about a 31 inch blade at the maximum. This is an original antique Japanese katana with a fairly old blade, probably 16th century, and this is around a 29.5 inch nagasa, or length of blade. And that's considered fairly long for a katana, but the main reason for that is because uchi katana or katana were shortened in the Edo period. Okay, so and that was for various legal reasons, but you know, perhaps also other considerations as well, which we won't get into here. This isn't a specifically Japanese sword video. But the fact is that the uchi katana tended to be about 28 inch long in the blade, but later ones are sometimes shorter for other reasons. Okay, now is that particularly short? We'll come to other Japanese swords in a second. Let's carefully put away this antique, keep it safe. So, first of all, is that true compared to European swords? Well, it depends which European swords we're looking at, and what people tend to compare it to is the European longsword. Now, the typical type of longsword replicated in the modern world, like this Albion ringneck here, has got about a 37 inch blade. But here's the news flash, folks. If you've been watching some of my auction videos where I've actually been looking at originals and giving measurements of originals, you will see that so-called long swords or bastard swords or hand and a half swords can have blades as short as 30 inches. Obviously they can have blades up to and in excess of 40 inches as well. So while the modern HEMA world tends to like about a 36, 37, 38 inch blade, in fact a lot of originals are really quite short, and in fact very often the blades are not particularly longer than a one-handed arming sword. Now when we get into one-handed arming swords and we look at originals, this is one of the Royal Armourer's replicas, so this is exactly same statistics as the original. They often have about 30 inch blades, but all the way down quite often to 26 or 27 inch blades, which is now in the realm of katana. So what we actually find is there's a crossover. Certainly if we look at arming swords, they can often be about the same blade length as a katana. However, just to play devil's advocate, I have to point out there are arming swords, such as this is an LK Chen one based on one which is currently in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a collaboration that I did with LK Chen, and this has a big blade. I think it's 36, 37 inches off the top of my head. These are long blades, but this is a Type 19 blade. Humongous reach on these things, and it is a particularly long reaching sword. So in fact we have an arming sword here which has the same blade length as a long sword here, about 37 inches. However, obviously we have shorter long swords than that, and we have arming swords which are generally speaking shorter. But in addition to that, there are other types of European sword around which are shorter. So here we have the Cinque Dea, which again is from the Royal Armourer's line, exactly, and that's actually quite a large Cinque Dea. And then we've got also things like this Krieger Langmesser, and these are clearly shorter. Now, if I just do a side-by-side comparison, if I carefully get that katana out again, there we go, you will see that actually the katana has a notably longer blade than this particular Langmesser. So to simply state that a Japanese katana is short compared to a European sword is clearly not correct. I mean, what do you mean by European sword? We could be looking at the Bronze Age. A Bronze Age leaf-bladed sword is going to be considerably shorter than the katana, but even if we're looking at steel-bladed swords, then the katana is not particularly short. And a lot of people will go, but what about the longer Japanese swords? Well, here I have from RVA Katana, we've got a Tachi here, which has been sent to me to review, and the review of this will be coming up. Now, the Tachi is, you will notice, bigger. But I want to point something out. Some people have said, well, you know, the Katana is the later, from late 15th century onwards, kind of samurai sword, and that is shorter for various reasons, whereas the earlier Tachi was longer. Well, that's not always true. As always, there were many different sizes of uchi katana, and there were many different sizes of Tachi as well. So very often we do find Tachi in their unaltered, unadulterated full-length state, which have blades of 32, 33, 34 inches. But that's still not huge. Bear in mind that that is still shorter than medieval, some anyway, medieval arming swords, and it's still shorter than most medieval longswords. So don't think that the typical Tachi is hugely bigger than a katana, because in many cases a katana can be the same size as a Tachi. And also there's a misconception here. Very often we find earlier Tachi blades used on later katana. So a lot of what you think are katana are actually earlier Tachi. If it predates the 15th century, it's pretty much got to be a Tachi. And in fact, the way that we define a Tachi is quite complicated. And in fact, different people would actually have slightly different definitions for them. It can be as subtle as which side of the nakago or tang the signature or mei is on. And it can be to do with the exact shape of the blade and things like this. But overall, really, Tachi and uchi katana aren't like completely distinct types of sword, and you'll often find the blade from one mounted on the other. So yes, it is true that generally earlier Tachi, so pre-15th century Tachi, are a little bit longer than, let's say, 16th century and later uchi katana or katana. It's not remarkably longer. Now, some of you will say, what about the O katana or the Odachi or the Nodachi? Well, fundamentally, they are quite specialised and not particularly common swords. So when we get into the realms of those, we're really talking about the Japanese equivalent of things like the Zweihänder. So they are specialised swords. They weren't the type of sword usually worn or usually carried by a standard samurai. Standard samurai usually wore either the katana edge up, part of a daisho with the wakizashi, or they wore the Tachi by itself with the edge down from slings. And bear in mind that these two swords were worn at the same time as well. So in the 16th century you could find Tachi being worn and uchi katana being worn in different situations. So Japanese swords are, it has to be said, generally speaking, not as long as the longer European swords. Okay, so if we're looking at a particularly long bladed arming sword, or we're looking at a long sword above a certain length, so when we're talking about the 37-inch kind of range, the typical range of long swords that people are used to now. But when you actually duck into museums or antique auctions and you get to handle originals, you'll notice that a lot of arming swords and a lot of long swords are shorter than that and are actually only a tiny bit longer than a typical katana, and very much kind of the same blade length as a typical Tachi. And I think what a lot of people also forget is we also have very abundant European swords which are shorter. And these are more the length of a wakizashi, maybe a little bit longer than a wakizashi, a little bit shorter than a katana. Anyway, so that's really all I want to say about this subject today, but I hope it will give you something to think about when trying to avoid making sweeping statements about Japanese swords are shorter than European swords. Which Japanese swords? Which European swords? Which period are you talking about? We need to be a bit more specific. And remember that whether you're looking at Japan or Europe, or indeed, and I almost forgot to mention this, China, okay, remember that the jian, for example, or the dao for that matter, come in various sizes and shapes. You'll often find a range of blade lengths between 20 inches all the way up to 40 inches, and there are a whole variety of swords, whether it's Japan, China, Europe, or indeed Africa or India. There are a whole bunch of different sword types which fall within this range, and making sweeping statements about Japanese swords are always shorter than European swords is clearly not a fact and not true. We need to qualify it and be more specific. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks!